Hello and welcome, and thanks so much for joining me today in this lesson. And I want to, always gets me in the head. Hello! So it's hello from him and it's hello from me. I want to do some very simple exercises, follow along exercises, and I don't want to talk too much about those and the theory of those, because for one thing, I've got a whole series looking at intentional movement, which is like a companion series to this. And when I finish this is like the beginners series. When I finish this, I'll probably integrate those, maybe change all the numbers of the lessons and integrate them all into one enormous course. And also later on in this series, I start introducing the idea also of slow movement. And one of the reasons for doing it like that is, you can't rush this stuff. It's better to do standing and practice some basic skills before moving on, and over the period of a year, eventually working up towards something like slow movement. But I want to do a little bit of that today. So it's important to do that, to get just moving. But I also want to talk a little bit and use that as a context to talk around the idea of something that people call dead training, or sometimes say empty training. And usually what people mean by that is that when you're doing, for example, your standing pole, or you're doing slow movement, or even shadow boxing or jiangwu, that there's no mental content there. So the training is empty, and the mental content is usually always linked to things that are going on inside the body, like not supernatural things, not like a kind of mystical force, but forces in the body, contradictory forces and tensions that you're playing with, and you're using visualization. And so the mental content and the physical content link together to create an amplified effect, and that's a key aspect of the Yiquan method. So usually when people say that the training shouldn't be dead or empty, they usually mean it shouldn't be like that. It should be like that, and it shouldn't just be like just movement without any mental content. So linguistically, one would think when we say dead training that we mean the opposite is live training, but usually when we say live training, we mean something like sparring or some kind of training platform where the techniques you've been developing are taken to another training stage, where you begin to work with an opponent who's resisting a little bit more. Usually that's what we mean by live training. So we've got one thing that we mean by dead training, and then we've got one thing that we mean by live training, and there's no connection between these two. They're not. So that's a little bit confusing in itself. And the next thing to say about this idea of dead training or empty training, or however you want to phrase it, is that when people say this, or when people give any kind of advice within the Yiquan community, it's very rarely constructive. It's very rarely given from the perspective of being of service to someone else and being constructive. It's usually just point scoring. That's because the Yiquan community is toxic. So in all honesty, most of the time it wouldn't matter what you do. These people are going to criticise it and say, if you do one thing, they'll say it's not the other, and so on, and that will just go on forever, because it's not about helping you, it's about putting you down. They can't elevate themselves, so they put you down. This toxicity structures the way that the advice is given, so it tends to be very polarised and very one-dimensional. It's always like, you must do this and everyone else is wrong, and you must do it like this. And well, one of the things is like, your training is just dead training and all that. Actually, it's not that simple. So each one's a living, breathing thing, and it lives and breathes in you as a practitioner. And sometimes I think it's one of the best things about it, that sometimes you can't engage the intent on that level to really be using visualization and get deep into it. I got some videos I put out. I was training in the sunshine a few weeks ago, and I'm doing an hour and a half, and it's super focused, and you can see I'm doing some very slow movement a lot of the time, super focused movement. You can't always get into that. You can't always get into that mindset, and that's okay. So sometimes it doesn't matter, and like particularly with standing, So, I mean, a couple of things to say about that is that when you're starting out, you don't really get the right feelings, or they might come and go. And also because even though it's not about time, it's about quality. I've said before, there's a more complex thing with standing, that some of the movement feelings that you get, they only kick in when the muscles kind of give way and relax after it. There's so much tension in the body, and one of the many things that standing teaches you is the amount of tension in the body and how we overuse muscles. And that's one of the things that we try to train at first. And once we start making progress in that, we can stand a little bit longer, and we can do different things as we're playing with the movement, even if it looks like there's nothing actually going on, that there's lots going on in terms of how we're playing with forces inside the body, not mystical forces, real physiological, biological tensions and counter tensions, tensegrity and so on, all these buzzwords people use now. It doesn't just happen at first because you're too tense. And the tension is very often like it's not quite conscious, so it's like you don't even realise. And you'll be standing there and just a muscle will relax, and you like a noise that's been going on so long you stop hearing it, you don't feel the tension. Even though it's not about standing for particular lengths of time, those effects only kick in after a certain amount of time. And even if you're quite used to standing and used to doing longer periods, that's still the same. Usually I'm always the same, like first 10 minutes will be quite tense, and then things will just start relaxing off again. That, by the by, is also one of the reasons why, like, there's a few people, well, it's inevitable when people start trying to make money out of martial arts that things get watered down. It's always been like that. But there's a real thing in each one now where, because it's a tough path in many ways. It's a tough ask to do the standing and so on, where that's been really watered down. So however that happens, it's always due to commercialisation, and it doesn't really matter what the rationale for that is. So in some groups, the rationale is like, well, you don't really need to do that anymore, it's not efficient and so on. Like Yaozong's says, like, actually standing is the shortcut, and there's no other shortcuts. Again, the people who are making these shortcuts, there's really nothing to show for it, so there's no reason to believe it. So there's one group that's virtually erased it because it's just, it's just not good for business to have people standing. There's other people who've changed it so like you do 5 minutes. And I don't mean in terms of learning standing. That's absolutely fine to do it like that, and in fact you should do it like that. Like I said before, like set aside an hour or half an hour. That's absolutely fine. Do 5 minutes. 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes. As you're learning, as a learning practice to learn endurance, and then you can time that. You can add add 20 seconds on each time and just build that. That's a really good way to do it. But there's another thing that people do where they change the method so that it's like, this is now the method. We do 5 minutes like this. We do 5 minutes in a different posture, and sell that as a means of improving sports performance and so on. And like that, like it can't work. Like that's the bottom line. It can't work. I mean, there might be some minor benefits, I suppose, from doing it like that, but it can't work for the very specific reason that it takes longer than 5 minutes for the musculature to relax, and then you have to work with, like it's the mistake of fetishizing the posture itself, and some of the stuff I've seen where it kind of links that into, well, very problematic ideas around use of the subconscious, like, accessing subconscious stuff. And subconscious isn't, as social scientists with a strong background in the philosophy of science and pseudoscience, subconscious, think about it, it's a very spatial concept, like beneath consciousness. To me, that's a very each one idea. So I use it as a shorthand concept, but when you start thinking of it as an actual real thing, that's a different, like a spatial dimension of your consciousnness. That's not an each one concept. The each one concept is that your whole body is conscious. Your whole body is conscious, and there's like the bit of it that's focused conscious, like the attention part of your consciousness. That's just one part of this overall thing. So thinking that you can do postures for 5 minutes and somehow access like subconscious controls, that's not, for me, that's not something that can work. But it's a matter for science, I suppose. But the reason it can't work is that you need to do postures for longer to get the musculature to relax, and then you need to play with the visualizations and the movements to get the micro effects, and that takes time. And if you start hopping between postures, and it's something that Wang Shengjai specifically says don't do, hopping between postures very, very quickly, then just you don't get that effect. Like, you've got to get very intense with it. And even with, like I say, some of the videos that I put up where I'm doing very slow movement, and you can see how much time I'm spending on, I'm spending on doing it just very slow. And that's a posture we can start with. So always do anyway, this kind of backwards and forwards, and it's a very simple. Don't have to do it that slow at first. I was getting into my vibe then. Like, well, slower, for example, than Tai Chi. And the point is, it doesn't have to be profoundly mindfully engaged. That's what I was getting at. Like, so this very obnoxious militant stance on being mindful. Yeah, we know that's the method, but actually, each one's organic. It's based around you. There's days where you just don't feel like that. I've got training routines where I can go to the gym and just not think about anything and just train, and there's no mindful engagement whatsoever because I'm thinking about something else, or I'm just trying to forget work or whatever else, or I'm just absolutely exhausted. And then there's other days where I'm, absolutely full on 100% mindfully engaged in training. And I also think that's really important for health, because there's people, let's give an example, like people with fibromyalgia, who there's days where the exhaustion is so much that they can't. I'm not going to start doing standing or this kind of training. There's days when they can, and there's days when they can't, but you could still, and there's days when there's mental exhaustion, but you might be able to physically do something, and everyone kind of has versions of that as well. So you might be able to just lie on a bed and visualize movement. That's one of the key skills that we want to develop, where you can actually visualize movement and feel it. You can feel the movement being triggered. So it's absolutely fine for postures to be empty, and I always say just push through. There's days where you're mindfully engaged and there's days where you're not. It's not necessarily completely healthy to force yourself to be totally mindfully engaged if you're not feeling that. So sometimes, like, I just haven't got the feeling, but I'll just push through with the movement, because my body's aware and mindful in its own right. And sometimes I use visualizations and sometimes I don't. It's not absolutely essential. So this very simple posture, just forwards and backwards. And even though it looks quite simple, there's so many interesting things to it. And one of the things is, look at the move, as you start, engaging. If we think about how we brace a posture, like if we were actually pushing something like that, there's an optimal way of bracing. But if someone's moving, then it changes how the bracing functions. It might go into a suboptimal. You're going to move over there and you're pushing this way. Now it's suboptimal because I want to get it in line with my body. And thinking about things like that and changing your movement around because that's one of the interesting things with these kind of movements, like the kind of guard engage and stuff like that, where you're taking down a guard, that you don't necessarily have to move someone else. You can move yourself around them if they're like an immovable object. You go like that and their guard doesn't move, some big muscle man. You can move yourself rather than, but it's a similar posture, just you can articulate a movement in a different way. So moving and engaging the hips and changing the way that the posture is being rooted to change. So sometimes I'm like pushing back, sometimes I'm pushing forward and side to side. And you can be really engaged with this. And I'm not even using any kind of visualization, it's just kind of second nature body movement now. I'm getting this particular mental focus before even visualization. So, you know, the idea that if you smile, you can kind of sometimes affect your actual mental state, you know, like whatever facial expression, you know, but this very different facial expression that's like, it's something close to wrath, like, but a cold sort of wrath, like what a brilliant military commander should have, you know, like just like a cold, absolute determination. I'm just trying to induce that mental state first of all. Eyes, you know, fixed on something, piercing something. No, not moving too fast, it's much slower, you know, than, for example, Tai Chi. And then thinking about visualization. And we can use visualization to really intensify the feeling. And this is something that really works. So, and it can work very intensely as well. Like it can be, there's degrees of the intensity. So there's times when you're training where the effect from visualization is just, like things start happening in the body and individual muscles like working in different ways but linking together. It's one of the contradictions, linking together into an overall system. Individual parts of the body just start getting a little bit more independent, but they're integrated much more into a kind of rippling holistic system. So visualizing, and there's people talked about, seeing people kind of, it's almost like religious arguments, you know, like people from different religious factions within one religion arguing over how many angels can sit on the head of a pin and so on. Like, do you need to have actually physically experienced something to be able to visualize it? And the answer is, well, it's kind of trivial, isn't it? Because the answer is obviously no, because lots of visualizations, even the orthodox visualizations, are not things that people have experienced. But you might have done so, like, you know, classic Wang Shanzhai visualization, someone pouring a ladle of warm water over your head. You might have experienced something like that. You might have experienced rain, but you never experienced that particular thing. But from your wider experiences, you can extrapolate what that will feel like. You know, I've never had someone pour ice cream over my head, but I can extrapolate from other experiences what that will feel like. But things like being pulled and pushed and so on, usually you've got experience of that, but the visualization itself doesn't need to be an exact replication of that. Just because when I was at school someone grabbed my wrists and spun me around, I don't have to visualize that. So I really like visualizations that involve the sea, because I really like the sea, but I also think like things in the sea or on the sea, they just really lend themselves to being very movable. So for example, a big ship, and having ropes attached to my arms that are attached to the ship, and the ship's trying to sail away and I'm pulling it, so then I can visualise like pulling the bow or the stern, whichever way they, you know, pulling the ship over, you know, rolling it over on its side, and then it rolls back the other way and I'm wrestling with it with these ropes. Or very similar, like Yao Zhongzong used to use visualizations with kites, the idea of flying kites like that, which is another one that's doesn't quite work in the same way for me. Like, I like the idea of the mass, the physical mass of the ship, that it's really immense, But then the next thing to say about like being mindful and using visualization like this is that there's a lot of over scientization in each run, and it's really useful for beginners to have things kind of categorized, so you can say, right, well, go forward and backwards 8 times. You know, you can visualize someone's pulling in and you pull them back, and they're resisting and they're sliding in mud, for example, like that. But you have to go, as you move on in your training, you've got to do more than that. So I guess like they become religious artifacts. Like saying, I think last week, you know, someone saying like there's 70 standing pole postures, exactly 70. So, you know, there's exactly 70 and there's exactly 8 of these and there's exactly, you know, X amount of shilling. No, there's an infinite, and the sooner you break into that, the better. So you don't just want to go forwards and backwards. So once you start visualizing, for example, this ship, then I want to change my visualization and I want to start playing with it. I'm moving that ship forwards and backwards. It's wrestling with me. It's using the wind and the waves to pull against. So I'm moving, I'm varying. It's resisting. Like I visualise like a big old sailing ship, big wooden ship. The content of the visualisation does matter. So from here we've got this visualisation, I'm on the beach or like maybe on a rock surrounded by water. Anyway, now we start playing with the boat is moving. And then other days, you won't even feel like that. So there's other days where you just get up, and actually it's tough to make yourself even do the training. And one of the things that's useful that really helps is to have things that you're working on in set periods of time, like in a month or 6 weeks, and working blocks like that. So you think like, well, if it's something pretty heavy like fitness and strength, like I'm going to work on that. You know, that's going to be my dominant training paradigm for a month. Then I'm going to switch to something else. Something more like, well, I really want to work on, you know, my articulated movements. So I'm going to work on that for 6 weeks. I'm going to do other things as well, but I'm going to put a lot of time in. And the fact that you've got a training plan, it gets into your mind and you think, well, I've got to do that, otherwise I'm going to fall behind in my training plan and so on. And that helps. But being cool with yourself helps. You know, like there's days where you just don't feel like it and trust your own body. And there's other days where you just can't invest the mental energy to be that mindfully engaged with, and that's fine. That's when you go back to your set training where you just think, well, I'm just going to do this forwards and back 8 times. And then there's other times where, like in the videos where I'm training outside doing some very, very slow movement, where just the simplest movements become more complex again because you're doing them so slowly and so mindfully engaged. And there's so much going on in the body. And for that kind of movement, these days I very often don't even use any visualization at all, because I want my mindfulness to be totally in my body and just feeling every But to get to this stage, I did use, and I still do use visualization, but to get to this stage I really used very strong, consistent, you know, visualization practice, virtual reality practice. It's contradictory, but there's a lot of benefit in that, you know, just not thinking about anything, just being very mindfully engaged with your own body. So I don't need to really demonstrate any more techniques. What I want people to do is just to go and just use a visualization and just start from forwards and backwards like this very simple movement, and then just start changing. Imagine, use that visualization as ropes tied to your arms, and like I recognise, you know, like each one's for everyone, so it's got to be adaptable. Like, you know, if you're missing a limb, if you're missing both limbs, adapt. Think about a different, you know, some way that you can use movement. That you're wrestling with this sea monster or pulling this boat, and then just start changing and moving it and shifting the. See the difference between like each one as a taught system, like where you do this 8 times and you do that 8 times and you do this 8 times, and there's 8 of those and there's 8 of those and 70 of these, and getting away from that and instead thinking about, well, how do I take ownership, you know, actually taking ownership and like intuitively proceeding, like where does it come from, all these different movements. They're not set in stone, they're not written on the walls of Shaolin Temple, they were in you. Just like Wang Shenjai said, once you start getting the principles, then they're just in you. You start playing with that and enjoying it. It has a lot of benefits, multiple different things. Most importantly, the micro cultivation of whole body interconnectivity, genuine whole body interconnectivity. And I repeat, you've got to do it for more than 5 minutes, like 5 minutes standing like this and 5 minutes standing like this. And you've got to do more than think about, well, if I stand like this, I'll access subconscious forces. What does that mean? There are things that are not fully within our attention, and I've said before that this is one of the reasons why breathing is so important traditionally in Chinese martial arts, because it's something that's normally not fully in our attention, but it's one of the easiest things of all to bring into our attention. from that kind of non-conscious function, you know. So, and then actually that's a template for what we want to do with everything else. Bring it into more conscious awareness, and then let it just go back into the outside part of our attention. You know, that's not what our attention is focused on. And think about the attention as just like one spot in a massive thing. Okay, that's it for today, for this lesson. So one love, and I'll see you in the next one. That doesn't mean we're going out. We're away anyway.